What happened to ISIL? Has the threat disappeared? Have they been defeated? Or are we kidding ourselves? An upfront special. Despite the horrific attack in Kabul this week, studies show that 2017 was the third consecutive year when the number of terrorist attacks around the world went down. And the number of attacks in the West claimed by ISIL has gone down by around 80% this year. So what does this all mean? Joining me on this special edition of Upfront to discuss the past, present and future of ISIL are Mia Bloom, a professor at Georgia State University and author of Dying to Kill, The Allure of Suicide Terror. John Mueller, professor of political science at Ohio State University and author of Overblown, How the Politicians and Terrorism Industry Inflate National Security Threats and Why We Believe Them. From London, RENAD MANSOUR, Middle East and North Africa Research Fellow at Chatham House. And from Lyon, NICOLAS, a journalist, a former ISIL hostage and author of Jihad Academy, The Rise of Islamic State. Thank you all for joining me on Upfront. Mia, let me start with you. Am I wrong in saying that despite a few really bad ISIL attacks like the one in November in Melbourne, Australia, the threat that ISIL poses, at least to the West, seems to have gone down? The media, we don't talk about it as often. Politicians aren't talking about the threat from ISIL. The attacks seem to have gone down compared to a year or two ago. Is that fair?
It depends on what you're calling the West. If you're calling North America the West, then absolutely. The number of attacks have gone down. The statistics for 2017 was that there were 65 terrorist attacks or terrorist events in the United States last year. More than 50% were extreme right wing. Yeah. But if you're looking at other places, if you're looking at Western Europe or you're looking at the rest of the world, we are largely ignoring places like Nigeria where the attacks have actually gone up, or places like Southeast Asia where in Indonesia or the Philippines, we really have to be concerned. So it's a combination of being concerned about the returning foreign fighters to Europe, but also the fact that there is a bit of a whack-a-mole, that a lot of ISIS propaganda and activity has moved from the West, from the Middle East, or at least Iraq and Syria, to other parts.
Nicolas in Lyon, according to one recent study in 2017, global terror attacks fell by a fifth and fatalities from those attacks fell by a quarter. That's a good news story, isn't it?
Well, the situation in 2013, 2014 was absolutely dramatic. We had thousands of people coming from our own countries, leaving our countries and joining this terrorist group, and in an incredible wave of departures that we never witnessed in the recent history. Now, for sure, it is very relaxing, at least, to see that this flow of volunteers for jihad has basically almost stopped from at least Europe. This is a very good news. The other thing that we need to look at is actually ISIL in the mind, and the fact that the attractivity of the group has barely decreased despite the loss of territory.
Okay. John Mueller, you, of course, have written an entire book saying the entire idea of terrorism threats in the terrorism quote-unquote industry is overblown. So what do you make of ISIL right now?
Well, it seems to be very much in decline. If you look at the American cases where they actually arrested people for trying to do Islamist terrorism in the United States, there are about over a dozen each in the previous 3 years, and this year there's been one. And when you look at the actual cases, many of these people are mentally disturbed, completely out of whack. If any, and they're not ISIL attacks, and they're basically people who are sort of inspired. Yeah. And ISIL, for a while there, was sort of the jihadist cool phrase to get. So many of these attacks are simply not serious. If they hadn't been interrupted, it's not clear anything would happen.
Here's my question to you. Yeah. We might agree now, based on the numbers, and even Mia's conceding in the US, North America, attacks are down. But even when attacks were high, quote unquote, you know, everything's relative, but when they were higher than they were now in 2015, 2016, even then, you were one of those voices saying, let's not hype this up.
Yes, the relevant statistics, as far as I'm concerned, is looking at all the years since 9/11. The number of people who have been killed by Islamist extremists in the United States is about 6 per year. It isn't much different in most of Europe, in much of the Western world, including Australia and so forth. That's 6 too many, obviously. We'd all prefer there'd be 0. But that's an incredibly small number of people. I once talked to somebody at the National Institutes of Health, and I said, suppose you had a disease that killed 6 people a year, how much money would you spend trying to eradicate it? And he looked back at me like I was crazy. I mean, there's so much more. You've got a limited amount of funds, and spending on a hazard that small is
I want to bring in RENAD MANSOUR, who's waiting patiently in London. But before I do, Mia, do you just want to briefly respond to John's point about madness of the spending compared to the number of deaths, at least here in the West?
Well, I'm going to agree with the madness of the spending. So that's the point that I agree. But at the same time, I would say that we have to look at the way in which it's aspiring, the fact, and to add to what Nicolas said, this jihad, this ISIS attracted more foreign fighters than Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya, and the previous war in Iraq put together. So it did have this ideational effect that I don't want to discount, but John is.
Well, we're going to come back to this, but it's a very nice segue into RENAD MANSOUR, who's in London. You're based in the UK, RENAD, but you regularly travel to work on the ground in Iraq, where a lot of these quote-unquote foreign fighters came into. Is it fair to say that ISIL, which has lost, I believe, 99% of its territory now in Iraq and Syria, territory that at one point was almost the size of Portugal, is it fair to say that they've been defeated on the ground in Iraq? Militarily, they've been defeated. Is that fair?
The network that has existed since the late 1990s going on through to the 2000s continues to exist. Of course, they go through phases where they take more territory and lose territory. But the issue here, and it kind of draws on to the conversation that we're having, many people look at ISIL as the disease itself, but actually ISIL is the symptom. Right? And so the problem we have in Iraq and Syria is actually a bigger problem, which is the failure of these governments, the failure of these states that allow for groups like ISIS to emerge. And it's also important to, I think, unpack the difference between the global jihad and the sort of local version of ISIL. So the global jihadist version, which really sprung up in 2011 after sort of what happened in Syria, but became part of the whole organization, that's kind of calmed down. But there are still local grievances, and many local-minded Iraqis and Syrians who are entertaining the ideas of groups like this because of more socio-economic reasons, not necessarily the idea of ISIS, which is something that's come up already today. So
just to be clear, though, in terms of the territory, though, so you're saying, yes, they've been pushed out of cities, they've been pushed out of Mosul, they don't control ground for their quote-unquote caliphate, but they're still there as a force in terms of networks, in terms of ideas, in terms of the allure to young, disillusioned people.
I mean, this is a very dynamic organization. I mean, it's gone through different, I mean, it's not the first time that ISIL has lost territories as a network. If you look at it a bit longer term, in 2008, 9, and 10, it also lost territory. And it makes an assumption that it will come back at some point, given the fact that everyone keeps focusing on the military solution and on ISIL rather than the actual problem that allows ISIL to emerge. And I've already outlined those. But nonetheless, at the moment, it still has quite a bit of cash that it's made over the last few years. It's still able to kind of reach out in parts of Iraq, particularly in some provinces, Diyala, Kirkuk, Salah ad-Din. It's emerging there. It had the first attacks in Mosul a few weeks ago, so it's emerging there. So it's not to kind of say, to scare that it's back to the 2014-15 levels, but nonetheless, it's important to note that it's not gone.
Nicolas, let me ask you this. You, of course, were a hostage held by ISIL out in the region. You wrote very lucidly after you came back about the people who had held you hostage. And I think you said, they watched the same TV shows as us, the same cartoons as us. A lot of people say, well, hold on, come on, these guys are religious fanatics. What do you say to them, having spent time with them against your will?
That they're very humane. And to some people, it could sound just crazy to try to give a picture of terrorists who are like the arch image of the evil, to give them a picture of being humane. What is humane also have weaknesses, and this is what we should work on much more.
John Mueller, you mentioned the point about 6 people are dead in North America, and obviously you're an American political scientist, you're looking at what the American government is doing at home and abroad. But when you listen to RENAD talk about what's happening in Iraq, and when you look at, for example, a recent UN report found mass graves from some of the ISIS-controlled areas that were taken back, they may have actually killed even more people than we thought. When you see what's happening in the Middle East, in North Africa, do you worry that your thesis about the threat being overblown is too American-centric?
Yes, in a lot of ways. It doesn't really present a threat to the United States or to Western Europe, as far as I can see. It's basically...
But you concede it's a massive threat in some of the countries?
Well, no, it's not a massive threat. It's a minor threat, it seems to me. You can have small groups. Al-Shabaab still causes problems in Somalia. And there are going to be people roaming around the Middle East screaming that they're actually members of ISIS because it's what one does, who are probably going to create trouble. But it's not, I don't think it's even a major problem there overall, and certainly far, far less than it was earlier when they when they were able to actually do these massacres that you talked about.
I'm going to disagree with that.
Okay, come in and then I'm going to go to RENAD.
So the reason I disagree is a lot of the foreign fighters that have left Iraq and Syria have gone to places like Libya, they've gone to Southeast Asia, they've gone to Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so the idea that these are not actual threats to the governments, I disagree. Having spent time in Pakistan, having traveled through these areas, talking to people who are former members of terrorist organizations, this is an actual threat to some governments, but he's right, not to the American government.
But you used the phrase earlier of whack-a-mole. Isn't that part of the problem? That if you've got this organization that can just pop up because it's an ideology as much as it is a physical group in different parts of the world, when you bomb them here, they go somewhere else. Where does that leave the overall strategy?
Well, it definitely resonates when the local government is corrupt and when people are feeling aggrieved, then it starts to have all of these global politics be very locally relevant. And that's where it becomes problematic. So that the ISIS fighters go in, but they link up with local groups who have local grievances, and many of these governments are very imperfect. And this is where it resonates and they become very popular with the rank and file.
RENAD, John is suggesting that even in the Middle East, the threat could be seen as overblown in parts, that they're not a threat to a lot of governments. Is that your view?
No, I think very clearly ISIS and the organization has had a massive threat and has had massive consequences on the populations in Syria and Iraq particularly, but elsewhere in the Middle East. I mean, having spent time over the years in Iraq, it's been devastating, and it's been a very dark time in the history of the country, and you have many families and many people affected by the organization, including the governments of these countries that are still unable to kind of rebuild.
So how do you think, for example, Western governments, which are trying to formulate their own security strategies and their own policies in the Middle East, how should they now be reacting in this new environment where ISIL has been physically removed from the scene in Iraq and Syria, but as you say, still poses a threat? What would you be saying to governments of the UK, of France, of the United States about their position on ISIL in the Middle East, at least?
I mean, we get this question all the time, and there are many different governments that are, trying to figure out what to do. Very clearly, what's happened is now that the territorial victory has been made, now that the military solution has been achieved, there's almost like, okay, well, let's pack up and go home. And that's exactly what happened in 2006, 7, 8, when at the time it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State of Iraq, only to have to come back again a few years later because the actual solution didn't include some of the more political and societal, socioeconomic solutions. So if my recommendation would be, if you want to fight ISIL, if you want to really get rid of this organization,
Isn't there a slight contradiction there? Because you talk about root causes and symptoms versus disease, and you say corruption, and you say misgovernance, and we know about sectarianism in Iraq, but you say come back a few years later. Some would argue that ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Iraq are a response to the US occupation in the first place.
To some extent. I mean, especially in the earlier years. But certainly in 2014, it wasn't a direct response to the American invasion. What it was a direct response to the failure of the state to rebuild itself in 2003. So the point I was trying to make was, if you really want to combat ISIS, it's about building these states. It's about corruption, it's about governance, it's about letting the people in Anbar or Mosul or Fallujah, or Diyala know that there is something there, an institution that can represent them and that can respond to their needs. If that is
and very briefly, RENAD, are we near that point in Iraq from your perspective? Are we near that point in Iraq? No,
we're not. We aren't close because no one's focusing on it.
Nicola, let me ask you this. Mia mentioned earlier foreign fighters and the number of people who went into Iraq and Syria from around the world to fight. A lot of those people have left to go to other war zones, quote unquote, but a lot of them have also come home to France, to Denmark, to the UK, to the United States, Canada. Is there a threat posed by those people?
Actually, what we have a couple of hundred who came back and they are currently in jail in France, and they do not represent a big threat. There are another couple of hundred who are currently detained on the zone in Syria, mostly in northern Syria, and these people, well, will have to be taken care of. For me, the people who are the bigger risk at the moment are the people who have been prevented from joining ISIS, because these people have been arrested like a couple of years ago. They have been arrested with very low charges just for a project of travel, and these people are not disappointed about ISIS, because the people who left ISIL, the returnees, are all of them somehow disappointed by what they have experienced with this utopia of caliphate. The others, those who have been arrested in the airport, they are not disillusionized. And these people still have a dream of a caliphate, and they have been prevented from joining this dream, and these people have a lot of rage.
John, do you believe there's a threat to Western countries from quote-unquote returnees?
No, I think it's not there. According to multiple reports in 2016, after the returnee attacks on Brussels and on Paris, there are continuous reports coming from the police as well as defectors that there are hundreds of people already there in Europe waiting for orders to take action. Now, none of these guys have shown up in the last 2 years. So that means either they didn't exist, or they're there and they're just watching pornography and eating pizza, or they gone on to other pursuits.
So let me ask you this, and I know time is short. You've written an entire book on the subject. But just for
several books.
Several books, but the book Overblown, which catches the imagination, that phrase overblown. What is pushing that? A lot of people watching say, okay, why would Western governments want to overblow a terrorist threat? Why would they behave in an alarmist fashion? Don't they have a duty of care to their citizens?
It's basically bottom up. Reese done a report at the Cato Institute on Public Opinion in the United States. And at its height, ISIS, when they asked people, do you think ISIS presents a serious threat to the survival or existence of the United States, 77% of the people who had been following the story said yes. And 50% of that 77% said strongly feel that way. So this is what happens if you're a politician. You have to give in to the whims of the masses, and so this money's been frittered away basically on a threat that basically, in any reasonable sense, it doesn't exist overall.
And there has been the media pushing the whole story, so that it used to be, if there was an attack, the media would wait to ascertain what the nature of the attack is. Now we start with the presumption of terrorism and then crawl it back when we find out that it isn't terrorism.
We find out it's a white dude.
We find out it's a white dude and we stop using the word.
Then it's not terrorism.
Well, we just don't use the word.
RENAD, let me ask you this. In Iraq, when you're on the ground in Iraq talking to Iraqis, do they feel as if, you know what, I mean, you mentioned the talk about, people moving on. Do they feel as if they've been forgotten or ignored in some way in this whole debate about terrorism, which is very Western-centric?
Well, I mean, as you say, it is Western-centric. I mean, terrorism for an Iraqi means something completely different, or for a Syrian, than it does to an American. Because if you want to talk about terrorist sort of numbers, many Iraqis and Syrians have been killed. It is a very real threat to their lives and to their safe being, livelihoods and safety in their countries. So, but Iraqis have, to some extent, they understand the threat. They're certainly happy. Syrians are also happy that, there's no longer this Islamic State caliphate, but, in Iraq and Mosul. I mean, there is a sense of joy that we've gotten over, as I mentioned, a dark part of the country's histories, but there's also a sense of disillusionment and a sense of fear that they've been here before.
Mia, let me ask you this. Is there a danger that by over-focusing on ISIL, we've lost track of other groups which also carry out all sorts of violence atrocities around the world. John mentioned earlier, in parts of Africa, in Kenya you've got Al-Shabaab, in Nigeria you've got Boko Haram. There are other groups. In Syria itself, apart from ISIL, there were plenty of other violent and quote-unquote extremist groups. Is there a danger that the focus on ISIL, and whether it's up or down, distracts us from other violent actors in other parts of the world?
So there's two things. The first is, with the focus on jihadi terrorism, the United States and the government and all of its agencies have completely ignored the rise of the extreme right and the domestic terrorists that are perpetrated, so that in the statistics I gave you before, of the 65 attacks in 2017, 37 were extreme right-wing white, the majority. But also, if you look at the Pew and the ACLU and other data that's come out from New America Foundation, since 9/11, 71% of the terrorist attacks have been from extreme right wing, with 26% being jihadi. So we have over-focused on one thing and ignored the other. But there's a second part to it, which draws from what you were saying about Trump. I worry about Europe and the United States with the rise of this rhetoric, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant rhetoric. We are laying a foundation for people to be so alienated and outraged that when there is an ISIS 2.0 or some new manifestation, people will start to feel that what their message is, it's resonating, because they've been alienated and treated so badly. We shouldn't do that.
Do you worry about an ISIS 2.0, John?
Not very much, no. I think it's dying and unlikely to be revived. Even ISIS, of course, was really revived by incredibly bad policies by the Maliki government in Iraq, going after Sunnis and so forth. You mentioned, by the way, earlier on about the issue about Americans helping, or the West helping. American foreign policy in the Middle East has been an abject failure for this whole bloody century. And the whole idea that they know how to do anything correct in Iraq or in any other countries, including Syria, is ludicrous, it seems to me.
So let me ask you...
calling upon the guys who created the problem in 2003
Indeed.
to try to solve it is impressive.
So let me pick up on that before we finish and ask a broader question about the West as a whole. Is it fair to say that you all agree with the idea that the quote-unquote war on terror hasn't been a success? Because a lot of people on the street would say, yeah, of course it's been a failure. And yet you see governments, leaders doubling down on the same policies. Renad, you want to go first?
It's a good point. I think people are so focused on the short term, and they're so focused on the minute details of, what's the organization, who are the fighters, how many are their numbers, that they kind of lose track at the greater picture, right? Even the question of, is there going to be an ISIS 2.0? It's the same organization that's existed, as I said, for decades. So there's a bit of short-termism that you see in governments, especially in the West, where you have different cycles, and also in think tanks and others, that leads us to not actually get the opportunity to sit back and reflect and say, is this the right strategy?
Nicolas, do you feel that your message in France is well heard? Are people in power receptive to what you're saying about terrorism?
Well, it's not obvious because there is, of course, some populistic pressure, but, well, I'm struggling to send this kind of messages. And but I'm personally afraid not of an IS 3.2.0, but of an IS 3.0, because for me ISIL is already the IS 2.0, because the original IS was founded in 2006 and almost defeated 4 years later.
Okay. Mia, what do you think? We've got, this statistic that I came across that in 2001, 1 in 5 conflicts in the Middle East, the Horn of Africa and the Sahel had a quote-unquote violent extremist element. Today, it's 3 out of 4 conflicts in that part of the world have a violent extremist element, to use the language of the report. That's a dismal failure for governments across the world in terms of fighting quote-unquote violent extremism, is it not?
It is, and the problem has been that because the American foreign policy has relied almost exclusively on military solutions, that in many ways, whether it's drones in Pakistan or boots on the ground in Iraq, they have definitely exacerbated the situation, and it has been almost the flame for which all of the moths have congregated and been attracted to areas to fight the Americans. That is a great rallying cry, and the problem is going to be whether or not this kind of ideology continues to be the inspiring North Star. So we have to be very sanguine about how we approach foreign policy, but what we've seen in the last 2 years has certainly not helped. Moving the embassy was not a good idea.
You were talking about the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem.
That was a terrible idea. And so I think that this kind of approach is going to continue to cause other problems and reverberate throughout the Middle East.
John, final word to you. You've written on this, as you say, for many years. You've been trying to get your message through about the scale of the threat. Do you believe now that the fall in attacks in places like North America, in the West, from groups like ISIL, will help you get your message through to the public or to policymakers? Are you optimistic that people will now start to go, you know what, maybe we did hype that threat?
I doubt it. I'm sort of very frustrated. I've been trying a long time. Basically, the media never talks about the statistics. They never say there were more people killed by terrorists in the 70s or 80s than there are now. That should be in every story. They never say, basically, there's 6 people killed per year. And so the question is it worth, so you could say that's a success. It's only 6, it could be 12. Yeah. Is it worth spending $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion on domestic homeland security in order to reduce that number by that small amount?
On that note, we'll have to leave it there. John, Mia, RENAD, Nicolas, thank you all for joining me on the show. Up Front will be back next week.